Um, I want to investigate this evening carpenters in the Middle Ages. They are a very important craft, as we've just heard. I want to look at their distribution. I want to look at their working practices. I want to look at the various different types of carpenter. They're worth investigating because they're such an important craft, but they're not much studied. There's a whole book published in the 1930s, which is still the standard work on masons. So if you work on in stone, you get the attention of historians, but if you work in wood, there isn't so much interest, and yet there's plenty of evidence, there's plenty of information available about them. I'll be using tax records, financial accounts, court records, wills, and so on. The full range of documentary sources, all of which make some reference to carpenters. But of course, the most important surviving evidence for their existence and for their work are the buildings themselves, of which, as we know, quite a number still survive. A tribute, if you like, to their skill that they're still standing up, and buildings that we can appreciate and admire. Um, Indeed, the buildings themselves are evidence of the training, dissemination of ideas, local cultures. There's a lot of information about the craftsmen from the buildings themselves. But I will be tending to emphasize the working life of the carpenters and emphasizing differences between them. Some of them are simply employed by the day, but others of them are contractors, and some of them can be described as entrepreneurs. A lot of there's a lot of modern goodwill towards carpenters, towards medieval carpenters in particular. Um, we think of them as being clever with joints. We think of them as being able to create buildings of considerable beauty, ones that we enjoy looking at. Um, and we we appreciate that they are designers of buildings as well as simply woodworkers. Um, Perhaps there's even a tendency to idealize them. One thinks of the writings of William Morris, for example, who elevated medieval craftsmanship to something that he admired himself, and urged that we should all admire the achievements of carpenters. Um, Perhaps the one could think of it as a rather traditional craft. And remarkably, of course, modern carpenters are not so working in so different ways. A self-employed carpenter now is not. His working life is not so completely different. I suppose the main thing is he's got a white van, which the medieval carpenter lacked, of course. Um, but their reputation in the Middle Ages is not so strong. Um, they they appear in fiction as gullible, rather stupid, drunken, or on the other side, they're sometimes portrayed as cunning and deceitful. In court records, you find them appearing, and this will seem familiar to the modern consumer, turning up late, promising to do a job and then either not doing it or doing it much later than expected. So carpenters really don't have a very strong reputation in the Middle Ages, as strong as we might think they deserve. And indeed, their status is not quite as high as we might expect. They're as I will show, they're not, many of them, not very rich, and they're not very politically powerful. Can I just make one point about the way in which modern historians approach crafts and industrial occupations, if you like, or non-agricultural occupations. It's become a major subject of research in the Cambridge Group for the Study of Population and Social Structure. They're interested in establishing the chronology of industrialization. And you see the starting point is obviously the 19th and 20th centuries, when the number of people employed in agriculture is very small. Even in the middle of the 19th century, only 25% of the English population were employed in farming. Now, is that low proportion of people employed in farming the result just of the Industrial Revolution? Is it the result of steam engines and so on in the mechanization of industry in the late 18th and 19th centuries? Well, the answer is no. It's a more gradual process, because if you go to the writings of Gregory King in the late 17th century, he says in 1688 that 60% of the population were employed in agriculture. So really quite a substantial minority, even in the 17th century, were employed in other activities, including industry and crafts, including, of course, carpenters. So they're part of that story. And if we go back to the Middle Ages, the modern historians have quite wrongly suggested that the agricultural population in the 14th century, say, was, well, they're very precise, 82%. 82% of people were employed in agriculture. Well, that's obviously ridiculous. We know that at least 18% of the population were living in towns and were very unlikely to have much agricultural work to do. So there's a lot of people employed in the countryside, including carpenters, who are obviously not primarily involved in agriculture. So, the story of the carpenter is also part of a bigger story about the industrialization, the modernization of English society. I think probably rather than counting people, which is, I mean, someone asked me what I was doing last week, and I said I'm counting carpenters. We count people who are described as carpenters and use that description to try and assess their importance and their numbers. But many people, of course, work part-time. I'll go on at more length about this, but people were not employed 100% as carpenters, and I think it would be better to try to work out how much time people spent in crafts and non-agricultural activities rather than the numbers of people. But still, that's a very difficult subject to research, because of course we don't have time sheets from the 14th century which would enable us to see exactly how much work in terms of time they did. Well, let's begin with this question of how many of them there are. And you can work out numbers by counting them in tax records or and various other sources, as I will show. The numbers suggest a substantial minority of people employed in the period, but not very great numbers. In 1379, in Wiltshire, we have considerable poll tax records, and that records 41 carpenters, which puts them quite high up in the hierarchy of different crafts and occupations. There were 63 weavers, for example. But of course, cloth making was a very important activity in Wiltshire at that time. When they were enforcing the labour laws in Wiltshire in 1358, they give the occupations of 217 male workers, and 16 of them were described as as carpenters. So it's 7% of the total, which is quite a high proportion, I think. Another way of getting a number is to see how many people Edward I demanded should be drafted to be, what we would call conscripted to assist with the castle building campaign in North Wales. And all sorts of craftsmen, masons, of course, in particular, were sent from each English county. And he demanded carpenters from every county. And for example, in Oxfordshire, he demanded that 47 should be sent to North Wales. So I presume that wasn't every carpenter in Oxfordshire. So one thinks that the number might have been considerably more than that. But these are just clues, really, just indications of the numbers involved. I should say, of course, that there's a problem of definition in that the word in the Middle Ages that was used to describe a carpenter in normal speech was a wright, W-R-I-G-H-T. And so carpenter and wright seem to be interchangeable. But that word wright was also used to describe more specialist woodworkers. So you have shipwrights and cartwrights and ploughwrights and wheelwrights and bridge wrights even. So all these people who claimed a specialism in a particular branch of woodworking. And indeed, the people who are simply called carpenters are involved in a whole lot of projects, not just the house building and house repair that we would expect to be their main activity. I'm sure that was their main activity, but they worked on mills and bridges and quays and wharfs and fences and all sorts of other wooden structures. They even made wheelbarrows and fixed furnishings, for example. I'll give you an example of that later. But the main problem about definition is not this question of whether they're called wrights or carpenters, or whether they're specialists like wheelwrights or general carpenters, but the problem of their being part-timers, and that many of them live in the countryside and many of them are in fact peasant cultivators. Who spend part of their time working as carpenters. You get the sort of evidence one can use for that is that you get, again, looking at the records of the labour laws, the rules about the remuneration and behaviour of wage workers in the period after the Black Death. In the 1370s, you get references to carpenters. In Essex, for example, a man was called by the jury telling us that he had misbehaved in some way, demanded too much money, that he was described as a labourer, ploughman and carpenter. So, carpentry was only one string in his bow, so to speak. I've come across a Worcestershire carpenter who held 30 acres of land. I mean, obviously, that must have taken up much of his time. There's in fact a famous Norfolk man who was a part-time carpenter, or had carpentry in his background, if you like, and that is Chaucer's Reeve, who came from Norfolk. As a reeve, he was involved in agriculture. He would have had a holding of land of his own, and he had the job also of managing the his lord's land. But you find that he was also a carpenter. He had been a carpenter and still seemed to identify with carpentry, because when Carpenter was mocked by one of the other pilgrims on the famous pilgrimage to Canterbury, he got rather cross and defended the reputation of carpenters. So, that's another piece of it's fictional evidence, of course, but of course Chaucer would only tell us that a man could be a carpenter and a reeve this audience would believe it. So it presumably has some a basis in reality. I concluded from looking at these hints about numbers from tax records and so on that there were perhaps about 4,000 or 5,000 carpenters working at any one time in the 14th and 15th centuries, which is the main period when one can do this research. But then I was flabbergasted because I thought, as I was going to talk to you, I ought to make a more detailed study of the Norfolk poll tax for 1379, of which quite a lot of entries survive. I started counting carpenters in Norfolk, and was rather surprised at how many of them there were. When the assessors of the tax in 1379 set about their task, they were not given detailed instructions on the information they needed to record. Some of them thought all they needed to do was to put down a name and put next to it fourpence, because that was the standard tax. But a number of them, fortunately for us, decided that they would try to record people's social status. So if someone was an esquire or a franklin or some superior person, they got that was put into the tax list. And if they had an occupation, that was sometimes recorded, sometimes in detail with many occupations, sometimes just one or two from one village. So it's a very inconsistent and unsatisfactory source. Well, there are 300 villages in the list of 1379 for Norfolk, and for 155 of them, there is evidence of occupations. The people drawing up the document thought it useful to tell us that of their people's occupations. And they did have a reason for this, because they had decided that they would charge people who were involved in trade or crafts sixpence instead of fourpence. So it was, they needed to justify, if you like, to themselves as to why certain people paid more in tax. Well, of these 155 villages, with these diligent and helpful villagers drawing up the list, 91 of them, that's what, 2/3, include carpenters among the occupations that they record. They'll have tailors and thatchers and weavers and so on, and they will also list carpenters. In all, they list 213 carpenters, which is vastly more than those in Wiltshire, for example, in the same tax. So really, I began to realise there are a lot of carpenters in Norfolk. 2/3 of the villages contain them, and those villages often have more than two. And we know they're undercounted, because as well as the records of 1379, we also have records from 1381, only 2 years later. And you find discrepancies. You find at Witton, for example, there are no carpenters mentioned in 1379, but 3 in 1381. Now, I'll probably mispronounce this, the village which I would think would be called Worstead, but may be called Worstead, in 1379 had 2 carpenters. In 1381, it had 6. It had a lot of weavers as well, of course. So the 213 figure must be an underestimate. They missed people out. And a more diligent survey in 1381 found a few more. So we're really already seeing that our 213 is a small figure. Also, we're only dealing with 155 villages, and there were 700 villages in Norfolk. So if I assume that the villages which are not recorded have the same number of carpenters as those that were, the figure I arrive at is 958. And if you take into account the under-recording, there must have been more than 1,000 carpenters working in Norfolk. So my national estimate of 5,000 must be too small, mustn't it? If you're a single county, I know Norfolk's a very special county, but one single special county can have so many. To emphasize the surprising abundance of carpenters in Norfolk, it's surprising to an outsider in Leicestershire that it's got so many. You would expect Norfolk to be superior in every way, I know, to any other county. But I mean, one interesting feature is that there are more carpenters than other crafts. There were, for example, there were very large numbers of tailors all over England. People did not make their own clothes, as is often supposed by modern commentators. They went to a tailor to have their clothes made. So there was a lot of tailoring going on. And tailoring became, in the later Middle Ages, more and more complicated. You couldn't knock up a doublet at home very easily. It was best left to an expert. Anyway, there are 213 carpenters, but only 123 tailors. Now, every house has to have a roof, and most of the rural houses, of course, have thatched roofs. So you'd expect to find very large numbers of thatchers. Well, 51 are recorded in these 155 villages. And everyone ate bread, of course, but there are only 22 bakers recorded. So it looks as if, for some reason, carpenters are being recorded more systematically than, more conscientiously than other crafts, which must have had considerably larger numbers than we are shown. Of course, what's special about Norfolk is that it's an exceptionally densely populated, commercialized, urbanized county. Of course, now rich Londoners go to Norfolk, don't they, to retire, and they go to Norfolk for rural calm. But it would be the opposite in the Middle Ages. It was a vibrant, productive county. Right, the population is estimated in 1377, another poll tax, as having 190,000 people. So our 1,000 carpenters are looking after that number of people. It's about 200 people or 50 households per carpenter. There must have been a lot of building going on to justify such large numbers. Right, so revelation for me, no surprise to you that Norfolk surpasses any other English county I know of in the numbers of carpenters. I now want to go on to look at where exactly having talked about counties, I want to look in more detail at where exactly the carpenters are located. So I'm going to show a first slide. I've done a number of maps based on much less full sources than the poll tax for Norfolk for 1379. That's right. Here's the first one. This is let's begin with the first one, shall we, which is Worcestershire. You're showing almost, you're robbing me of all surprise. Every slide has been shown. No, please just show us Worcestershire. Help. What's happened to Worcestershire?
Oh, I think Ian's having a few technical issues. Bear with. We can't see the slideshow, Ian.
While he's undoing the technical problems, I'll tell you what happens in Worcestershire, where the evidence comes from tax records and legal records of 1275. Now, the great advantage of working on sources of that period, 1275, 13th century, is that surnames are relatively new. Your surnames are really being introduced at the end of the 12th century and in the 13th century, and you could choose to identify someone from where he lived, or how we're getting back. You could identify someone from where he lived, or whether he had black hair or not, or whatever. Or there's someone in Worcestershire called Blackbird, who I take it was good at singing. Anyway, you could identify people by their craft. And so a minority, at least, of people are named after the craft that they pursued. And carpenters are named in these Worcestershire records, and you can plot them on the map, and you can show that only a minority of them are living in towns. There are 24 recorded, 3 live in towns. It's only a tiny proportion of the total, of course, judging from the Norfolk evidence, but nonetheless, I think it's significant that our sample includes only 3 urban carpenters.
Can I ask if you can see the screen now?
I can see the screen, but I can't see my first slide, my second slide. There we are. Don't take it away. Right. So this is the county of Worcestershire, and you see that you've got a few in the middle there is Worcester. There are a few in the towns, but most of them are scattered over the countryside. There are a number in the southeast, which is the most densely populated arable farming area, but a lot of them are in the wooded area of western Worcestershire. So not surprisingly, I suppose carpenters live near sources of timber. So that I suppose that's the example, the conclusion one might draw. And if I quickly flick through to the next slide, which is of Warwickshire, you see on the left, you see again figures from the early 14th, this time from the early 14th century, but still where the surnames are some guide as to people's occupations. You see very few of them at all in the south and east of the county, which is the arable farming area with very little woodland, very little pastoralism and so on, but an awful lot of them in the north and west of the county. And there's quite an interesting little knot of them near Coventry. And I suspect what happens is that carpenters settle in villages near to a big town and seek work in probably in town and country, but they obviously get more work if they can get involved in Coventry. And on the right-hand side, this is a much scrappier source. This is again 1379, but you see again this little group of carpenters in the vicinity of Coventry at Stychel, which is not spelt like that, and Bulkington have little clusters of carpenters, and I'll say a bit more about these clusters later. And the next one shows us Gloucestershire. There we are in 1327. Again, the surname evidence is being used. Very few in the Cotswolds. Most of them are in the area called the Vale, or on the edge of the Forest of Dean. And I think the important thing here to mention is not so much the availability of timber, but the fact that these the Vale and Dean are much less agricultural, or shall we say, there's a higher proportion of people involved in all sorts of crafts and trades. There's a cloth industry and so on, as well as as well as carpentry and other crafts. So you must think of the Vale and the Forest as being an area of great variety, socially variable, in which obviously carpenters form part of that more, shall we say, industrial society. Right, let's move on to the next one. This is not very informative. This is informative. I'll say something about that in a moment. So I've talked about these clusters, some of them near towns, where carpenters are obviously living in the country, but often working in the town. And but the evidence is very much circumstantial. I mean, you see it um, in Norfolk as well. Um, uh, we haven't got much evidence for villages near Norwich, but obviously villages near King's Lynn, for example, have carpenters living in them. Um, but it's very difficult in the case of Norfolk to see big regional differences. In fact, there are more carpenters in the extreme east of the county, in Tunstead Hundred, Tunstead itself, and in Felmingham, you've got really quite large groups of carpenters, and these are, these are obviously rural carpenters serving the countryside, I suppose. But let's just say something about um, the flow of building workers into a town. And there, what one needs are detailed account records. And the best ones I know are for the guild in Stratford-on-Avon. And what these records do is to record that the guild was endowed with quite large numbers of houses in the town. And so the guild, in order to keep the rent income coming in, had to keep on repairing and rebuilding houses in the town, and therefore employing building workers. But the guild tells us, has other ways of telling us about the link between carpenters and the town, because carpenters joined the guild. They became brothers, and their wives became guild members as well. They enrolled in the guild, presumably because they were working in the town or hoped to get work in the town, and thought it was a good idea to have contacts with townspeople. I mean, the guild was a religious organization, and I'm sure they were all sincerely religious, but it's also a bit like the Rotary Club or something. It was where you could meet up with people, make business contacts, make useful friendships. Anyway, what the map shows are rural carpenters who are moving into the town or coming into the town to do building work, or to join the fraternity. And you see they all come from the same part of the countryside, that is, or except for one. They're mostly from the Arden, which is a more wooded area, and where there's a lot more industry of all kinds. And you can see that not only have I marked on the map the place of origin of these building workers, but also the place of origin of timber, because those crosses mark the purchase of timber by the fraternity. And most of this evidence relates actually to the 1460s, when the guild was very active in repairing and maintaining its buildings. And fortunately, the clerk who kept the records was very good at telling us where people came from and giving us details about the people who were employed. Well, I've told you a bit then about the places where carpenters were to be found and where they lived, but I haven't said much about their traveling. Or at least I've implied that they're traveling. I mean, these people you can see on this picture have been traveling quite a long way, for sometimes 16 miles or whatever, to work. But in table 1, which is now going to appear, I say table 1, there's only one table, in fact, so can we, there we are, it is again. Keep it on, don't take it away. Right. So this is the collection of data, evidence of different carpenters recorded in many, many different sources, where we're told where they lived and where they worked. And so the distances are an indication of the travel that they've undergone in order to do their work. I've done the distances in miles. I hope you don't feel too upset about that. But if you think in kilometers, you'll have to do your own calculation. Anyway, what this shows is that about a third of them, yes, the strange red lines appearing, aren't they? They're just slightly distracting, but I'm sure they're there for a purpose. Right. Let's just say that a third of them are working at home. I mean, a third of them are people living in places like Oxford or London, where we have very good sources, who are finding their work in their own town. So that's one category. But that means all the rest of them are doing a certain amount of travel. And you can see another third are traveling relatively short distances, up to about 12 miles. And then you have people right at the top who are moving very, very long distances indeed. A carpenter will often appear in the records as working for a short time. I mean, there are a whole lot of small-scale jobs. Let's give you an example. A carpenter for making a door for 2 days at 5p per day, 10p. You know, that's the sort of job that a lot of them are doing. That's, I mean, it's rather like the records one might expect of the man with the white van I was talking about earlier in modern times. I've got a Norfolk reference. Norwich Priory in 1302 employed 2 carpenters for 2 weeks for 6 and 9p. If you work it out, that means 4p. They're getting 4p per day. And they also paid 3 and 8p for timber, and 1 and 2p for nails. You know, that was a sort of expenditure that was involved in not a tiny job, but a relatively small job. And a lot of carpenters are doing that sort of work. They're working by the day or by the week. But then you have people who work by the task, and these are the people one might think of as contractors, who are perhaps getting £3 or £5 or some figure of that kind for building a whole house or some other major project of that kind. I've divided the carpenters into 4 categories, as you see on the slide. At the top, you have the people I call celebrity carpenters. These are people right at the top of the trade, people who are employed by very big very rich employers, very influential employers. And there are lots of examples. I mean, just take one, Humphrey Cook, who was employed by the king. And during his career, he visited Berwick-on-Tweed, Eton, Oxford, Westminster, and that's between 1490 and 1531. He was obviously, you know, one might say he's probably a consultant. You know, he wasn't sort of banging nails into wood, but advising on how a roof should be designed and so on. I think they're very much in that higher category. They're not jobbing workers themselves at all. And the rewards were pretty enormous. William of Wintringham, who perhaps came from Huntingdonshire, I don't know, but anyway, was living in Southwark, south of the river in London. contracted with John of Gaunt in 1380 to build a chapel and other structures in Hertford Castle. And he was obviously a building contractor because part of the work was in stone, but he was obviously given the job of enlisting the masons as well as the carpenters. And he got £440 in quarterly instalments over a period of 3 years. I mean, that was good money, wasn't it? I mean, it obviously didn't pocket £440. There were a lot of expenses involved, but he was still obviously making a profit. And you find these celebrity carpenters prospering and doing things like owning mills and inns and, investing in property, even becoming property developers themselves. And so the celebrity carpenter works for good money from wealthy patrons. And presumably their names are passed around from, one can imagine in the King's Council or Parliament or somewhere, one lord telling another that there's a jolly good carpenter in Southwark, and passing on the news that there was someone who could manage big building contracts. Now, for the contractors, these are the category of people who are, as you say from the figures, traveling some distance, and they're the ones who are doing, as I suggested earlier, jobs for a large sum of money, £3, £4, £5, that sort of thing, not in the £440 category, but perhaps having access to timber, and therefore, providing their own timber as well as doing the work, and having having a sort of professional setup with a framing yard. There was a framing yard at Kingston on Thames, for example, used by a London carpenter. So there you would, cut the timber, get it ready for assembly, and then carry it by boat or cart to the building site. These are people who would be forward-looking. They would have to calculate the length of the job. They would have planned. They call them plats. They'd have drawings on parchment of their of the work that they were doing, and they had to have capital. And some of them would actually borrow money in order to be able to carry out their contract. Just let me tell you about one contracting carpenter to give you an idea of the way they operated. This is John Duke of Rolvenden in Sussex, who worked on a Sussex manor house, the Mote, spelled M-O-T-E, between 1464 and 1471. He had 2 sons working with him and 3 men, not specifying their sort of status. They trimmed timber, they put in window frames, they made furniture, they made beds and benches, and they supplied their timber, and indeed, to give you an idea of how well rewarded Duke was and how well funded, that when he died, he was able to bequeath to his son 100 oak trees, presumably in some big timber yard ready for use. It's interesting, by the way, this business of the craft being hereditary. You see it when you look at Duke. Obviously, his sons were involved. He assumed that his sons would succeed him in the work. That wasn't the same at a lower level, where you find that sons often didn't follow in their father's craft. They saw how much hard work was involved and found something better and better rewarded. There's evidence for this in York, that there isn't a great deal of succession between fathers and sons. Some of these people were very specialized. they did particular types of work. I mean, I take it using a Norfolk example. There's a man called John Hare of Diss, who was engaged by the Abbot of Bury St Edmunds to build a new windmill at Tivitshall, not very far away, in 1434. He did it for £6, 6 and 8 pence, and he was paid in 3 instalments. So it was all very carefully set out what he had to do. Part of his reward was to have the timber from the old mill. He was obviously demolishing an old unsatisfactory mill and putting in a new one. Now, I take it that if you got involved in mill building, that you had certain special knowledge, that you had a reputation perhaps as a millwright or someone who knew how mills worked. And you find people being called bridge wrights who specialized in building bridges and so on. They had the right craft. So I must move on and just talk about the people lower down the scale, the rather much larger number of people who I've used a rather silly phrase of heroic artisans, by which I mean people who went out working for daily wages. They lacked capital. They didn't have employees. They didn't necessarily provide their own materials. They relied on their employers to buy the materials. And they may even have actually worked for these big contractors and celebrities, as well as taking on jobs of their own. So what you find here is the way in which these people are quite flexible in joining in sometimes with other carpenters to get the work done. There was a job going in Worcestershire in 1392 where the employer wanted 2 buildings to be dismantled in a village called Bradley, and then carted and re-erected at Droitwich, the salt, the town heavily involved in the salt industry, and the new buildings were to be used as industrial buildings involved in boiling salt. So here we have the need for quite a lot of work. Dismantling, moving, re-erecting. And of course, it's a very interesting confirmation of something that we know from standing buildings, that timbers were reused and buildings could be dismantled and re-erected. The job lasted 3 weeks and there were 3 carpenters employed. Now, whether they were employed separately or whether they worked as partners, we don't know. But it's obviously you needed the labour of a number of people to join together, being paid by the day, but taking on quite in that case, quite a large job. And then right at the bottom, you have the large numbers of people who are self-reliant carpenters, who are sometimes working very much part-time, doing bits of work, 3 days here and 4 days there. These are the very important jobbing carpenters who do a lot of the work, and they probably build houses as well as repairing them and doing things like doors and window frames. There was a nice example of their mobility, though. They still moved around. There was one in Lincolnshire in 1373 the villagers complained that he never worked in the village but preferred to work outside, presumably getting higher wages that way. And there are lots of examples of people, working away from home for these relatively small rewards. They were willing to travel, 5 or 10 miles to get their work. on the whole, they are not that well rewarded. They're not rich people. You can tell that from the rates of pay. The rate of pay isn't too bad. It's threepence before 1350, fourpence afterwards, and fivepence or sixpence in the 15th century. If you worked every day, if you worked for 240 days in the year, shall we say, if that's the number of working days possible, then that would bring you in quite a large income. But of course, they didn't work every day. Some days they couldn't work. If you're working outside and it was snowing or something, it might be too difficult. But above all, there must have been long gaps between employment. One imagines getting a 3-day job somewhere and then hanging around waiting for another one to appear. And before mobile phones, it must have been quite difficult to communicate and find your for the carpenter to find employment continuously. So there are lots of gaps, and the daily rate of pay is not is an indication that they were had some skill, and their work was valued, but it didn't give them large sums. And you can see this from their tax, the way they pay taxes. I told you already that in Norfolk, most carpenters pay sixpence in tax rather than fourpence, which is the normal one for ordinary people. But it doesn't suggest great wealth. One or two pay 12pence, so they were obviously much better off. Quite a lot of them are single. The poll tax, rather strangely, sometimes tells you about people who are married and those who are single. And there's quite a lot of single carpenters, as if perhaps they couldn't even afford to get married because of the irregular amount of money that they gained. There's not much evidence of formal apprenticeship, but obviously young people, sons with their fathers, young people working for a skilled carpenter would pick up the expertise they needed in an informal way. Well, I suppose it is an apprenticeship, but it's not called that. They didn't belong to guilds. They were not organized in that way. There are one or two guilds in towns like Coventry and Salisbury, but they don't seem to have included all the carpenters. They were not as powerful as the big guilds of cloth workers, for example. But I suppose that those clusters that I talked about are a good example of how carpenters could work together, and perhaps they passed on skills and trained each other because they did live in the same village, and they must have been rivals, if you like, for work, but they can't have been totally hostile towards each other. They must sometimes have worked together and learned from each other. There's an interesting controversy, of course, about schools of carpentry, different ways of building. I mean, the part of the world I know best, in the Midlands, there is cruck building. I don't think you have any crucks at all, do you, in Norfolk? Anyway, it's the eastern part of the country is outside the cruck area. Now, what does that mean for this carpenter's skill? Did they specialize? Were the carpenters who only knew how to build cruck houses and couldn't do any other sort? Or was it, or were they more flexible? Did they have the ability to build structures of different type? And of course, there's a complicated problem of the role of the employer. There must have been a dialogue between the craftsman and the person employing them to build a house, say, about how the house should be designed, and perhaps they may even have specified the employers may have specified particular features. So one shouldn't assume when you see something special in a building that it's the result of the ingenuity of the carpenter. It may be that he's got that idea from somebody else. So I end by, again, another, after I was puzzled by Norfolk, I now remain uncertain, I think, about how it was that carpenters developed different ways of working, and therefore resulting in the different styles of building that we see around us. I suppose that one thing one could say is that towns did develop certain special features in their buildings which spread to the countryside. I'm thinking of jettying, for example, and I suppose that you could argue that that must mean that sometimes urban carpenters either passed on ideas to their rural counterparts, or that sometimes urban carpenters went into the countryside and built buildings in the style that they were accustomed to build in the towns, because obviously jettying began as an urban type. Right, so I'll finish. My summing up is to say that carpenters do deserve our attention. They were an important craft. They achieved great things. They had great skill. They were very numerous, and they tell us a great deal about the diverse forms of employment that existed in a period when we rather assume that everyone was involved in agriculture. They were numerous, but I am completely unable to explain why there are so many of them in Norfolk. I find that still a bit of a problem, and I'm sure you are going to tell me how I should sort of resolve that problem. But in the latter part of my talk, I was emphasizing the hierarchy among carpenters, the different levels of achievement, the different rewards, and the different types of work in which they were involved. And then finally, I leave you with another puzzle, which is the source of the styles, design, the varied styles, designs, and techniques that woodworkers used in building their houses. Thank you.